So, I've had this camera for almost 2 years now, and let me tell you why me, as a stock photographer and videographer, still think this is the best hybrid camera I've ever used. So, this is Sony A7IV. It's not the newest camera on the market, it's already around 2 years old. And since then a few other cameras were released, but if I were buying a new camera right now, I would still buy this one because it's just so good. And what is so good about this camera that I like it so much? So the first thing is the price. Right now you can get this camera for around 2,500 euros here in Europe or around $2,300 in the US. Well, it's certainly not the cheapest camera, especially if you're just starting out in photography, but compared to those $4,000 to $5,000 cameras like Canon R5, Sony A7R5 or Nikon Z8, it's very cheap. And it's just so amazing what you get for this price. For example, like I said, Sony A7R4 costs around 4,700 euros here in Europe. And I get it, A7R5 is a different, better, more capable camera, but for almost double the price. And me, for example, I don't need all the features of that camera. So let's look at some features of this camera that make this a perfect camera for my needs. Okay, first thing is megapixel count. This camera has a full-frame 33 megapixel sensor, which in my opinion is just optimal for stock photography. For stock photography you don't need that 45 or 60 megapixels like some cameras have. But it's also good to have some room for cropping, so for my taste 24 megapixels is just a little bit too low. But this one with 33 megapixel sensor is just that sweet spot. You can still crop your image quite a lot if you have to level the image in post or if you want to change the composition slightly and still get an image with enough megapixels for most uses. Also, the file sizes won't be enormous like the ones from a 60 megapixel camera, so you will save a lot of disk space with that. Now, the next thing I like so much about this camera is its autofocus system. It's just amazing. If I just compare it to the one from A7R4 camera, which I also have, it's like night and day. I almost don't have any autofocus shots, so when I'm selecting images from a photo shoot, I can focus only on composition, people's faces and emotions, and not worry about if the image is in focus. The focus mode I'm using the most is this tracking expand spot mode. So it will show this frame on the screen which you can move around, and when you press the shutter halfway it will lock the focus to that subject or face in the box, and now you can move the frame around, recompose and capture a shot. And if there's a face even near the box, it will automatically focus on the person's face or the person's eye. The other mode I also like to use, especially when I'm shooting video, is this wide focusing mode. Here the camera will automatically focus on what it thinks is the most important part of the scene. And if you have people in your shots, it will focus on people's faces. This mode is great if you have one person in the shot, but the problem is if you have more people in your shots, sometimes it will not focus on the face you want. And also, if you shoot a scene without people, it usually won't focus on the thing you want. Well, you can always override that with clicking on the screen to focus on the thing you want, but I found out that tracking expand spot mode is better, because I put that box on the person or thing I want to focus on and the focus will stay on that person. Okay, the next thing I love about this camera is color science. You may have heard that Sony does not have the best color science, especially in older cameras. For example, with images from my Sony A7R4, I was often pulling my hair out because I could not get the colors right. And in Sony A7R2 that I had a few years ago, it was even worse. But in this camera, color science is so much better. Well, I still prefer Nikon's colors over Sony's, so if Nikon cameras were a little bit better at shooting video a few years ago, I would never even switch to Sony, but also Sony is getting better and better. So yeah, it's much easier to get the colors that you want with this camera compared to their older cameras. Also, the menu system is so much better than it used to be. If you ever used Sony cameras before, you almost had to be a programmer to understand the menu system in their cameras. But they totally changed the menus in this camera, so it's much more intuitive and a lot easier to use. Well, they introduced that even before. I think the Sony A7S3 was the first camera that had these new menus. But in older cameras like A7R4, for example, even finding the format card option was a pain in the you-know-where. Okay, so if you're a hybrid shooter and you shoot photos and videos, this is a great camera. They implemented this dial up here where you can easily switch from photo to video mode, which is great, and you can also set which settings the camera should transfer from photo to video mode, so you don't have to change that every time when you switch to video mode. For example, let's suppose I'm shooting photos with a shutter speed of 1/1000 of a second and then I want to shoot some videos, so I switch to video mode. When I do that, the camera will automatically set the shutter speed to 1/50th of a second and also turn the auto ISO off and set it to 800 because that's the base ISO for this camera when shooting in S-Log. This camera shoots in 4K, obviously, and it can also shoot in 60 frames per second, so you can slow the footage down and get some slow motion shots if you want to. The not so good thing here is that it crops the footage to APS-C mode if you shoot at 60 frames per second. Well, it's not the end of the world, but it would be great if you could shoot 60 frames per second without a crop. And the quality of the footage is amazing. In my opinion, it's even better, a bit sharper than in their A7S3 model, which is more expensive and made mostly for video. Another good thing is that if you're shooting at 24 or 30 frames per second, because it's 33 megapixel sensor, you can use both full frame mode and also crop mode, and you can shoot 4K in both modes. So if you're shooting, for example, with a 35mm lens and you need a bit narrower field of view, you can use the crop mode and you will get the same field of view as you would with around 52mm lens. So you actually have two lenses in one. Well, it's not exactly the same because you would get a little bit shallower depth of field if you used a 50mm lens on full frame mode, but it's a great option to have. And when I'm shooting videos, I also use these Freewell magnetic ND filters, because especially if you're shooting outdoors, when you switch to video mode and you want to shoot with shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, there will be too much light. So what I do is I screw this thing on like that, even before the shoot, and it already has a VND base, which is actually around one stop ND filter, which won't affect your image much, and I'll just shoot photos with that on. Or if you want, you can just easily remove it and that's it. But then when I want to shoot video, I just attach this 2 to 5 stop ND filter, or if needed even 6 to 9 stops, and I'm ready to shoot. So this is a great thing. I'll put a link down below if you want to check that out. This is the old version of their filters, which is not ideal because when you shoot with this 2 to 5 stop ND, it will change the colors a little bit, it will make the image a little bit warmer, and when you replace it with 6 to 9 stops, it will be even warmer. So not ideal, but they have a new version which is supposed to be true color, so it won't change the colors when you switch between different filters. Okay, another feature I like to use with this camera are these custom dial options. This is not a new thing, it was also here in their previous cameras, but it's great. You can set this to whatever settings you use the most and quickly switch between them. So if I'm shooting a real-time video, I'm just using this manual mode, but if I want to shoot in slow motion, I switch this to custom mode number 1 and it will switch to 4K 50 frames per second, and if I switch it to custom mode number 2, it will set the camera to shoot in 100 frames per second in full HD. and that's just much faster than going into the menus and setting all those things there. So just setting these custom modes to the settings you use the most will save you a lot of time on the shoot. I also love that a lot of these buttons on the back are customizable, so if you find yourself using one setting a lot, you can just set one of these buttons to access that setting quickly without going into the menus. I won't go into details about what settings I mapped to a specific button here, but if you're interested, let me know. So like I said, I use this camera mainly for taking photos because I like to have two cameras on the shoot, one for photos and one for video, especially if I'm shooting video with a gimbal, because that way I can just switch the camera and I'm ready to go. I use this one for taking photos and Sony A7IV for video, but if I was only using one camera, this one would be the camera of my choice. Okay, I'm not sure if there's anything else to add here. It's a great camera, I would buy it again if I would be buying right now. And if you have any questions about the camera, let me know. If you want to know how to sell your photos or videos online, definitely check out my other videos on my channel. And until next time, stay awesome, keep shooting, and I will see you in my next video.